today. My name is Samir Kalra. I'm the Managing Director with the Hindu American Foundation. Welcome to the That's So Hindu podcast. We're joined today on the podcast by one of our favorite guests and returning guests, Sam Westrop, who has served as the Director of Islamist Watch at the Middle East Forum since 2017. He's going to be discussing the Middle East Forum's new groundbreaking report exposing State Department and USAID projects funding extremist Islamist organizations, and in some cases, those with links to terrorist organizations in both the Middle East and South Asia. The Middle East Forum was founded in 1994 and promotes American interests in the Middle East and protects Western values from Middle Eastern threats. Before coming to the Middle East Forum, Sam ran Stand for Peace, a London-based counter-extremism organization monitoring Islamists through the UK. Welcome back to the podcast, Sam. Great to have you back with us.
It's wonderful to be back. Thank you.
So, Sam, there's obviously been a lot of buzz in the media lately about some of the public revelations on what's been happening at the State Department and USAID in particular, in terms of highlighting the extent of wasteful spending that's been occurring, funding for extremist groups, as well as funding that can be seen as meddling in the internal affairs of other countries through promoting particular socio-cultural and or political agendas. But you've been tracking a lot of this for much longer, particularly the funding of Islamist extremist groups and those with links to terror groups. And that was the focus of your new report, which was actually published prior to a lot of the public announcements about cuts at USAID. Can you start by talking about what the impetus for this particular study or report was? And then we can talk a little bit more about some of the details and what you found.
Yeah, of course. As you say, we've been tracking this subject for quite a few years, not just USAID funding, but federal, indeed, state and international government funding as well. In other words, government funding across the board, we have been interested in as it relates to extremism and terror. USAID has offered and state have offered particularly appalling examples over the last few decades of how not to partner with the Muslim world. They have moved, and as you said, we'll get into the details later, but broadly, they have moved many, many millions into the hands of some very bad people. And we've been writing about this for almost a decade now. And until last month, no one else was really that interested. Our friends at the Hindu American Foundation would work on it, as would a few journalists would work on some single data points here and there. But largely, this wasn't of interest to the right or the left, both in Congress and the media. The arrival of Donald Trump for his second term in the White House has changed things in ways that we weren't fully expecting, given the sheer pugnaciousness of it all. It took us aback. So we were already working on something to take advantage of new, fresh eyes in the White House, new people at USA, new people at state. We were also encouraged by growing discomfort in Congress. They had been writing some letters about some of the USAID funding. The Inspector General's office at USAID was doing a genuinely good job in starting to investigate some internal goings on. So things were happening. And the report sought, yes, to capitalize on the new administration, but also to continue an impetus we felt was finally beginning to grow independent of the Trump administration as well.
Great. And one thing I just want to clarify for our our listeners, is that both at the Middle East Forum as well as the Hindu American Foundation, we have no issues with the Muslim community at large. The focus is on Islamism, which is a religio-political ideology that seeks to, support extremism and also in many cases suppress minorities across the world. And so that's the main focus. And just to make sure that everyone very clearly understands that we're not talking about Muslims more broadly, we're talking about a very, very specific religio-political ideology.
That's right. And, my boss or, the founder of the Middle East Forum, Daniel Pipes, always says, if radical Islam is the problem, then moderate Islam must be part of the solution. And so that's underpinned our work and our work with your group and other groups for the last decade. We work with Muslims, we fund Muslims, we join Muslim organizations in opposing the threat of Islamism. And with this USAID report and with our other federal funding investigations, the focus is precisely that. delineating government funding to radicals versus government funding to moderates. And I'm sorry to say the reformists receive almost nothing. The radicals are getting the bulk of government subsidy.
Absolutely. And let's take a few minutes to kind of delve into who those groups actually are. You highlighted in this report a few specific groups. And interestingly, for those that have been following this issue for a while, those groups are actually very familiar groups in terms of the presence of them doing quote unquote charitable work, but also knowing them for their ties to a lot of actual terrorist groups in both the Middle East as well as South Asia. So can you highlight some of those main radical groups and why are they problematic in terms of where their ties actually extend to and who they've actually been working with?
Yes. So first, a caveat. This is not all the bad USAID funding there is. This is really just the funding to Western organizations we think are funding extremism abroad. There are a couple of foreign organizations in the mix, but that's because they operate proxies or shell offices in the West as well. So this is really just looking at donations to Western Islamists and a few of their fellow travelers. Now, we have uncovered $164 million of USAID and state money that we think ended up in the hands of bad actors domestically. 122 million of that 164 was given to groups that we can state fairly explicitly are aligned with terrorism. So these may be groups that are openly funding Hamas proxies in the Gaza Strip. They may be working with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, or indeed, they may be groups whose staff express support for acts of terrorism to no punishment or concern from charity officials. So it's a mix of these recipients. It's a mix of organizations that are providing, at times, what appears to be a form of material support to designated organizations, and at other times are providing propaganda, agitprop, abstract but equally dangerous support as well. And so, I can give you a few examples. In the Gaza Strip, the Bayadère Association has received $900,000 from USAID. It received these through an intermediary because USAID often works for a primary awardee and a sub-awardee. And USAID too often trusts the primary awardee to vet the secondary award, the sub-awardee. So we can get into the details of why vetting is so terribly implemented later, but just to state that outright, that's how a lot of this works and how a lot of the problem grants appear. And the Bayadère Association is a Gaza-based organization that was working with three Western charities. One is called the Catholic Relief Services, a non-Muslim group who have a poor choice in the company they keep. Another was the American Near East Refugee Agency, a very prominent partner of USAID. And a third was Islamic Relief, a big Islamist group. So already you can see the network is getting big already, and we're just discussing one grantee. Now, the Bayadère Association is a Hamas charity. It talks about the fact that it is a Hamas charity. It discusses its meetings with senior Hamas officials and Hamas Politburo members. In fact, at one of the events that these charities supported, the Bayadère Association's project in Gaza, this was just before the 2023 attacks, was attended by the son of Ismail Haniyeh, the late Hamas leader. So there's no doubt about who this charity is and the kind of company they keep. Another example might be the Unlimited Friends Association, funded by 7 Western 501c, of which 5 have taken USAID funds. And the Unlimited Friends Association, or UFA, published on their social media their desire to cleanse their land of, quote, the impurity of the Jews. This is extreme stuff. This is not a group that is, by virtue of being in Gaza, has to work with the Hamas government. This is a group firmly, ideologically, and financially and logistically committed to Islamist terror rule in the Palestinian territories. So that's what it looks like in somewhere like Gaza. But then you also have funding here domestically as well. There's a huge concern. There's a lot of media attention on the campus protests last year. Well, the Tides Foundation, which funds a number of the pro-Hamas organizations involved in campus work, got money from the State Department, despite being a very well-known radical charity that funds radical causes around the world. Or there's groups like Interaction, a massive lobbying partner of the State Department that is an umbrella group for dozens of humanitarian aid charities in America, including a significant contingent of Islamist aid charities. And Interaction has served as the lobbying arm for Islamist groups for years, despite receiving tens of millions of federal dollars. Interaction lobbies the federal government to allow charities to partner with or at least work in areas controlled by terrorist organizations and have a greater degree of freedom to which they can partner with these terrorist organizations. So the amount of money here is just astonishing. It's tens, hundreds of millions of dollars going into the pockets of both terrorist proxies abroad, but also their lobbyists and their fellow travelers and useful idiots here in DC and elsewhere. This is an enormous problem. And I mentioned before, this is just state and USAID. And if we start talking one day, and not now, but when we start releasing reports on DHS, on Department of Agriculture, on FEMA, and all these other agencies and departments, I'm afraid that number, the amount of your dollars, your taxpayer dollars, going into the pockets of these groups will be even greater. My guess is that at least $500 million we can find to Islamist groups across the board. And that's a statistic I haven't published yet. So it's announced first here on the Hindu American Foundation podcast.
Breaking news.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I can go into far more detail. You mentioned South Asia. You've mentioned some other places. The data, by the way, I should add, is all available on our report published at meforum.org. So if anyone wants to look at the raw data and track it in the system themselves, they'll welcome it. And, certainly we can go into any of the specific examples. But one other thing I'll point out is that there's another tranche of money we don't know about, because USAID hides money under anonymized grants. It will list hundreds of millions of dollars to places like Syria and other terror-stricken areas of the world, and list the recipients only as miscellaneous foreign awardees. They like to anonymize huge amounts. Now, there's a reason for this. USAID is an arm of the intelligence community, or at least it's an asset for the intelligence community. It always has been. And there's not necessarily a problem. It makes sense that a country would want to use its international development arm to further one's agenda. Now, the conversation in DC at the moment is that maybe this actually isn't always in America's interest, how USAID operates. But nonetheless, conceptually, one can understand why USAID would be an asset for the intelligence services. And therefore, one can understand why sometimes money is not reported as transparently as we, the taxpayer, would like it to be. The problem is the federal government, as we now know, does not behave well when it comes to choosing its partners. And in fact, of those anonymous grants to, quote, miscellaneous awardees that we identified, we discovered that several million had gone to an organization, had been embezzled, according to a Department of Justice report, by someone who moved that money in Syria to Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate. What the Department of Justice neglected to mention when it announced all these charges was this money had been part of an anonymous grant. And we found that it had been part of one of these anonymous grant programs. So there was a lot of money out there moving anonymously through the USAID system and published in data records without any details that allow us to track it. And we just don't know where it ends up. So for that money that ended up with al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria, who knows how much has gone to Hizbul Mujahideen in Kashmir, or to terrorists in the Far East, or radicals in Egypt, or indeed, it doesn't have to be related to Islamism, maybe other radical forces around the world, from Khalistanis to independence movements in the Congo. I don't know. We have no way to track it because USAID is not being straight with us about where that money is going.
And I think that's something that's important to emphasize, is that your report is actually based on only what you have been able to uncover and what you've been able to find, but God knows what else is being given, as you mentioned. And I think it's also important to note that you're not interpreting or providing an opinion on anything. This is straightforward, raw data that you're just taking that's there and you're putting into this report. So it's not like this is a point of view or this is an opinion on whether this is happening or not. It's a fact that this is happening, and the data clearly supports that and points to the very clear linkages that are there. And in many cases, these groups, as you mentioned, they tell you who they are. I mean, they don't hide and try to say that they're not radical in their views. They are very openly radical, and we're taking it from their own websites or their own statements or their own social media posts. So there's no interpretation, again, about what their views are or what they support or what they don't support. One thing that I found very fascinating is, and you touched on this when you mentioned some of the awardees that then would give it to sub-awardees. And one of them that you mentioned was the Catholic Relief Services. And I think another name that I read in the report was World Vision, which of course is a Christian evangelical group. So do you see that when these groups are getting money and then they're giving it to these sub-awardees that are oftentimes some of these radical groups, do you see that as just a lack of proper vetting, or that they may know about this and they just, for whatever reason, don't care because maybe they're getting something out of it? What do you feel is the reason that, that's happening, where you would think that those groups that are getting the awards and then giving it to some of these radical groups are ideologically opposed and completely at odds in terms of how they view things?
So I wish I could say that these intermediaries, these non-Islamist intermediaries, are simply doing this out of sheer unavoidable error, and that once they realize their mistake, they immediately implement reforms that stop this from ever happening again. I wish that were the case, but we have shown over the years that this is absolutely not the case. World Vision offers a fascinating example of this, because we proved in 2017 that they had arranged for several $100,000 to be awarded to a designated terrorist group, a group called the Islamic Relief Agency in the Sudan. At the time, it was a close. The grant was in the early 2010s, and it all came to a head around 2014. But at the time, of course, this was the Omar al-Bashir regime in Sudan, and this charity was very close to this regime, which was an Islamist regime linked to Al-Qaeda, as was this charity. Meanwhile, was linked to bin Laden. And World Vision knew this. They knew what this charity was. They knew what it represented. They only came to USAID eventually to say, hey, we've partnered with a designated terrorist organization, because whistleblowers threatened to expose them for doing so. They then lobbied not the right word, they then bullied the federal government, who were irritatingly pliable, into allowing this partnership to continue and a one-off payment be issued to honor the agreement. In other words, the federal government allowed themselves to be bullied by this evangelical charity so they wouldn't be in a contractual breach with a bin Laden charity. This is an absurd situation. And World Vision's response was not to say, World Vision's narrative at the time in Sudan was that, if we don't do this, we will be kicked out of Sudan. And moves were being made to kick them out around that time. They said, we won't be able to provide aid. People will suffer. There'll be, Sudanese will suffer because we're not there to provide the aid they need, the water they need, the shelter they need. So on the face of it, that's not a totally unreasonable argument if you accept the long-term cost of allowing a charity to partner with a bin Laden affiliate. But in practice, World Vision has a longer history of doing this around the world with other terrorist groups. They've most recently been in the news because one of their officials in the Palestinian territories was siphoning monies to Hamas. So what has World Vision's response to this been when they've been caught working with Hamas or working with a bin Laden affiliate? And indeed, there are other examples as well with World Vision. Their response has been to attack their accusers, not to say, my God, we are an enormous charity with a responsibility to spend our money and taxpayers' money that were given responsibly. No, their response has been to attack, including me, their accusers. And when the Senate Finance Committee investigated World Vision because of its misuse of USAID money a few years ago, they found exactly what we did, that World Vision had been obfuscatory and perfidious and was responsible for really a huge amount of this problem and lived in denial and in hostility when confronted. So it's difficult. Now, is World Vision, are they secretly caliphate supporting Islamists? No, these are evangelical Christians who operate a bloated aid charity that poses, by the way, as a church in the IRS's eyes. They are at best a pathetic organization that does a lot of damage. At worst, they enable and have funded terror and will probably continue to do so. In fact, we even found after World Vision had convinced the US government to allow them to fund this Al-Qaeda, this bin Laden affiliate in Sudan, they advertised a job in one of their European branches for a further partnership with the same group after the fact. So again, you have to wonder. Now, this isn't the only example. I won't go into full detail on this one, but the American Near East Refugee Agency, $12.5 million given to them last year, or the year before perhaps, They openly partner with Hamas proxies, and we have drawn attention to their leadership, the fact that their staff have endorsed the killing of Jews. Their staff in Gaza endorsed the killing of Jews, and they did not do a thing about it. They got in touch before that point to threaten us for writing about them critically, threaten us with legal action. But when we drew attention to the fact that their staff were engaging in pro-Hamas propaganda and inciting the killing of a people, not interested. So, I cannot bring myself to excuse these people as just useful idiots. I think they are complicit in an enormous terror finance operation. One likes to think that somehow they found a way to justify it to themselves that is altruistic and good, but I can't possibly see the angle they're taking in these examples.
No, absolutely. And that is, I think it's disturbing on many levels. One is an organization that's, as you mentioned, is actually organized as a church. And so is taking advantage of the 501c3 system here in the US as well. And then is, part of this award system and kind of being able to facilitate these grants. And I'm sure, there's a financial advantage for these awardees as well, right? They're going to take off their amount off the top just from the grant award for administrative purposes. Then they give it down to the subawardee, and then they have the advantage of, whatever they're doing on the ground in those particular countries. So I think at multiple levels, I think there's multiple, failures. There's multiple, things that obviously have not just gone through the cracks, but have been intentionally pushed through, which brings us to the question of, how can USAID, or how is USAID or the administration, and whatever we say may be the ties to the intelligence community, et cetera, feel that this is actually in the best interests of America? How is that even justified? Even if they were to say, yes, we're doing this, we're using this USAID agency in order to further American interests, when we see where the money trail is actually leading, how can that be justified to be supporting that theory or that?
It's important to make. I brought up the intelligence angle because undoubtedly that has underpinned some of USAID's decisions, including its bad decisions, especially State Department as well. And remember, a lot of these groups we're talking about get money from either or both the state and USAID, even though USAID is technically under state's purview. So some of it, no doubt, falls down to intelligence decisions. And just on the intelligence point, since about 2007, 2008, the US intelligence community has really got terror finance very wrong. And we could probably do a whole other podcast hour on this subject. So not for now, but very briefly, the general shifts in 2008, actually around the time the Obama administration came in, was that the Bush administration's prosecution of terrorist movements like Hamas had been problematic. And then in the fight against Salafi jihad, so then Al-Qaeda, but later the Islamic State, groups like Jamaat-e-Islami, the Muslim Brotherhood, and then by extension their terror arms from Hizbul Mujahideen to Hamas should be assets to the West in the fight against Salafi jihad. And I've had this confirmed by intelligence officials and congressional staff on a number of occasions, that the US government partly, at the very least, turned a blind eye to Hamas charities' activities, and at best may have funded them because they saw them as allies in the fight against violent Islamism. It's an old story. You use violent extremists to fight violent extremists, and it doesn't work out. So that's part of it. And quite clearly, that's not in the US interest, ultimately. It hasn't worked. I don't think I can point to a single, and this isn't unique to America, by the way. I used to do this job, as you mentioned in your intro, in the UK. I had the same conversation with British security officials there about this, an utter stupidity when it came to understanding Islamism, thinking that there's a soft and a hard Islamism in which Al-Qaeda can be tempered by the moderation of Hamas is a lunacy you'll find across European policy circles still today. So that's the intelligence side. But it doesn't account for all the data we've accounted. No, I have to put a lot of it down to foolish civil servants, not caring, not interested in who they're funding, only seeing X number of meals handed out, X number of schools and houses built, and maybe knowing there could be a dangerous political angle, but preferring to look the other way or not bothering to investigate. And that is the case with most of these examples we've uncovered. Vetting was not done, or it was carried out poorly and no one bothered to check. Part of it comes down to the vetting failures, the vetting policy failures at USAID. Also, little accountability for the federal government. The media doesn't track government spending until about a month ago. The media didn't track government spending, even though it was published openly on a website. Your listeners can go there, usaspending.gov. Go look for yourself what federal departments have been funding. I note, by the way, that about 3 weeks ago, with the new administration coming in, the website suddenly slowed to a crawl and has not worked as well as it was previously. Could be coincidence. I'm a little suspicious of that, or of the timing there. But you can track this. You'll find examples we've missed just by virtue of going through the data, or indeed examples of different parts of the world that we haven't focused on that should get attention. There's a huge amount to investigate here, and the media didn't want to, both from the right and left. Congress wasn't interested unless you brought them some research already prepared and backed and order. Be fine. But to go out on their own and check government spending, no, they weren't doing it. I mentioned there are other problems in other departments, and we hope to publish more reports on this soon. You'll hopefully see why I think this is just a complete crisis and a complete failure of Congress and the fourth estate, the media, to hold the executive to account under both the previous Trump and Biden and Obama and Bush administrations. Everyone has behaved badly here. So yeah, I don't think you can fully explain the agenda of USAID under any administration. I think you can put it down to, at least in part, to the stupidity and the fecklessness of a bloated bureaucracy. They do so much more damage, in some ways more damage than an ideologically committed bureaucrat with a pro-Hamas bent could do. In some ways, it's the lazy bureaucrats who don't care who are even more dangerous. I mentioned, one last thing I'll say is I mentioned World Vision earlier. We're talking about how much fault lay with them. I should add, though, we should not exonerate USAID completely in the World Vision scandal, because yes, World Vision bullied them, but USAID and other government officials acquiesced. And in fact, something we found out a few years ago and published about was that the UN team under Obama administration, led by Samantha Powers, one of her deputies worked to delist the Sudanese terror group Islamic Relief Agency, not at that particularly anyone's request. They just autonomously went out and tried to delist them. Samantha Powers, of course, who ran that UN team, then went on to become USAID administrator under Joe Biden. So again, there's a lot of guilt to go around. There's a lot of blame to go around. And while dangerous intermediaries like World Vision do a great deal of damage, nothing compares to the feckless civil servants and the ideologically driven civil servants who work to make this terror finance happen.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Congress in there as well, and Congress not caring or not wanting to investigate. Is there also an aspect of it where there's lobbying, a lot of heavy lobbying being done by these groups that are, either them directly or their proxies that you mentioned, like Interaction, for instance, is one of those that kind of lobbies on behalf as an umbrella organization for many. And we know Jamaat-e-Islami has had a very powerful lobbyist, apparatus here in the U.S. and the West in general through their, proxy groups, as well as kind of through lobbying firms to look the other way. What aspect or what, do you think, what level of involvement or impact does that lobbying have? And also no investigations or not really looking or delving into some of these issues?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to bring that up. And Interaction is a good example of this. I mentioned it's an umbrella group for lots of different charities, but it carried out for many years something called the Together Project, which was a subgroup within Interaction controlled by these Islamist charities. And it was really three charities in particular that led this program. One was Islamic Relief. I mentioned them earlier, big Muslim Brotherhood charity, headquartered in the UK, very dangerous. The second was the Zakat Foundation, charity closely linked to the Turkish regime and run by someone who was implicated in al-Qaeda financing back in the 2000s. And then third, Helping Hand for Relief and Development, the international aid arm of Jamaat-e-Islami in the United States. So fascinating coalition of Islamist forces there, the Turks, the Brotherhood, and Jamaat. Not the first time they've worked together. this Together project, really run by these three groups, was carried out in collaboration with a fourth organization called the Charity and Security Network. The Charity and Security Network has been lobbying for years to legalize the financing of terrorism on humanitarian grounds. And they make the argument, and I think they might have actually used South Kashmiri terrorism or Pakistani terrorist groups as an example when they made this case. But they argue that yes, terror groups control charities, but the good of funding a terror group charity, in other words, the immediate good of the philanthropy that does, outweighs the bad of subsidizing a terror group. And they make this case repeatedly and unashamedly, knowing that what they're advocating will kill people. And this group, Charity and Security Network, that works with these free Islamist charities at the Together project, which is part of Interaction, I know there's a lot of entities going on here, are really governed by their own far left ideological agenda as well. So there's a mix of ideological and practical forces here. And in order to, and all that was as by way of background, not only do they lobby for these changes, and particularly, by the way, bank de-risking, making it de-risking, making it easier for Islamist charities to move money to bank accounts abroad at questionable financial institutions, all this kind of thing. Not only do they do all this, they also go after the critics of the charity in Congress. So a few years ago, we discovered that Interaction, led by Helping Hand, this Jamaat-e-Islami charity, was running around congressional offices, handing out papers to different folks on both sides of the House, accusing the Middle East Forum, my organization, of lying, of deceiving, of personal attacks on me and my colleagues as well, attempting, in other words, to undermine our research and undermine our warnings that these charities were financing terrorism. They hired a very prominent law firm, Perkins Coie, to provide some legal threats, which they then also handed out to these congressional officers so they could see that this was a serious business. They are not the first to do this. Islamic Relief has been going around Congress for years, providing copy to certain members to push back against House hearings into their behavior and so on. So the lobbying side of this is enormous. And then, you mentioned Jamaat yourself. Well, we mustn't forget that Jamaat occasionally sends lobbyists over to the United States from abroad using British Jamaati-Islami barristers from the UK to lobby here in DC. So, Islamism and its international lobbying arms are well financed and very effective, and have convinced more than a few congressmen to turn a blind eye. I think the most extraordinary example of this, to me, and this is less USAID related, but was Congressman Jim Banks, who for many years was wonderful on the subject of Jamaat-e-Islami, right up until the point he got some money from Pakistani donors in his district and elsewhere, and suddenly started turning up at Jamaat-e-Islami events, including with some terror-tied people linked to a group called Friends of Kashmir, which is very supportive of violence in both the Indian and Pakistani side of the line of control. So, congressmen are easily bought, easily convinced. There are a few standout members out there who have done the right thing over the years, and people like Charles Grassley in the Senate come particularly to mind. And we're pleased to see over the last month that people on both sides of the House are finally starting to actually talk about our research in Congress. And we had Senator Kennedy just last week discussing our report and its findings in the Senate. So we're pleased this is changing, but I got to say, Congress's behavior and its willingness to listen to these terror agenda lobbyists has been very alarming.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had our own experiences with that at HAF when, pushing human rights resolutions in Bangladesh. And of course, Jamaat-e-Islami actually suspected war criminals that were convicted in absentia in Bangladesh are, allegedly have been hiding out in the US, and they themselves hired lobbyists. I think Cassidy and Associates was one of those firms that they hired to be doing a PR campaign on the Hill and opposing resolutions that was condemning what had happened during the 1971 genocide in Bangladesh, where Jamaat-e-Islami, in conjunction with the West Pakistani Army, of course, was responsible for mass violence against Hindus and ethnic Bengalis. And just really quickly for our listeners that may not know, just connecting the dots between Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami was ideologically inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood and is the South Asian equivalent that came up in the early 1900s and is the preeminent South Asian Islamist organization that has served as the ideological and logistical support base for many of the terror groups and religious extremist parties that we see operating throughout the subcontinent.
Yeah, in fact, just as an example, in the UK, a very prominent Islamist think tank called the Islamic Foundation, up in a place called Markfield, has 2 dining rooms. Actually, I think I might have said this on the last episode of the podcast, so forgive me for not repeating myself, but it's a good fact. It has 2 dining rooms in this think tank, and one is called the Sayyid Qutb room. He is the ideological inspiration for the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other is called the Abu al-Mududi room, the founder, of course, of Jamaat-e-Islami. So Islamists in the West regard these organizations as sister movements, indelibly intertwined.
Absolutely. So, Sam, I think at this stage, I want to talk a little bit about, what comes next. We obviously see a lot of attempts now to kind of really open the books on what's happening and try to create some reform. But I want to talk specifically about this issue of funding of extremism, whether it's through USAID, whether it's through the State Department, or whether it's the ability of these groups that have Western bases in the US that are 501c3s to manipulate the system here. Do you see that changing? And do you see any attempt to actually kind of crack down through the IRS, and any other agencies, Treasury Department, et cetera, to be able to put a focus on those groups? And why are they even able to operate as 501c3s when they are ostensibly violating, these laws?
Okay. Yeah, this is an excellent question. I think there are 2 things here. One, the viability of reforming the 501c system, and 2, what will the federal government look like by the end of this administration? Because a lot is happening right now, and it's difficult to see where things are headed when it comes to the layout, the minutiae of federal behavior. Once the legal dust settles, USAID may still be around in its exact form it was 2 months ago, for all we know, or it could be gone completely, as is perhaps the plan of some. I think just sticking to second for the moment on the future of this. USAID, if it's subsumed into state, that doesn't solve the problem we've identified in our report, which is that the federal government doesn't vet its partners and grantees. And where it does claim to vet them, it doesn't do a good enough job, either deliberately or through just, poor performance. Unless there is fundamental reform in the way that the federal government sees its partners, its vendors, its grantees, this will continue, whether through state and along through every other agency and department. It's difficult for the federal government to discriminate on ideological grounds when it comes to grantees. There are lots of court rulings about this. It is a constitutional question, partly because, especially when you start talking about Islamism, the Islamist groups will say they're Muslim groups. It becomes freedom of religion. It becomes First Amendment matter. This is a very difficult thing. And so reform is not just required at the policy level, but there are going to have to be some court rulings and some legislative changes as well to make this work. That said, there's a reason you don't see the KKK getting USAID money. So someone somewhere discriminates and gets away with it when it comes to certain ideological recipients. They could stop funding Islamist terror if they wanted to. It might be a harder legal battle than it is with a nutty neo-Nazi or KKK group, but it's possible. So again, poor decisions are being made on that front. Reform, however, would at least give the benefit of providing a formal means for the government to make the right choice. Whether it can be done well remains to be seen. We're certainly working on policy documents to try and help them do that. The other side of this is the 501c system more broadly. I am a 501c skeptic. I do not like the non-profit system in this country. I'm torn between the desire to tear it down and the desire to reform it. Now, in Europe, if you're a registered charity, you're not just regulated by the government to make sure you're, performing financially the way you're reporting financially the way you claim to be. It's not just a financial mechanism. You're also being regulated morally and ethically. the government is checking that you are charitable in a benevolent sense a lot of the time. This is not really the case in the United States. 501cs, yes, they have to have if they're a public charity, they have to have a charitable purpose, but it doesn't carry the same philanthropic weight that it does in Europe. In other words, if I want to set up a charity to educate people on the benefits of Marxism, neo-Nazism, Islam, or whatever, I can. There's nothing stopping me from doing that. If I tried to set up a neo-Nazi charity in the UK, I'd have a lot of trouble. And so Islamists and other radicals and neo-Nazis on the far left, they flourish in the 501c system because it's just a tax-exempt option for them to, earn more money, keep more money, hide more money. Now, the wonderful advantage to the US 501c system is the reporting. They publish tax returns, except for churches. And it won't surprise you to know that a lot of Islamist charities doing work abroad claim to be churches. Mosques, but churches. We mentioned World Vision earlier. There's a non-Islamist example of that. The Islamic Society of North America, very important Islamist group founded by the Brotherhood. They don't file tax returns publicly. They claim to be a mosque, church. There are some instant reforms you could carry out. Getting rid of the church exemption, I think, would be a wonderful thing. I think it would do a lot of good. There are other things you can do on transparency that would make it easier to track terror and thus inhibit terror finance. For example, currently public charities don't publish Schedule B, which is their list of contributors. I think if you get government monies, you should probably be forced to publish your Schedule B, your list of contributors, find out who else is subsidizing this. Or Schedule F, for example, in their tax return, which lists their foreign activities and their foreign partners. I think they should be forced to publish that if you get government money. So there's small reforms you could do that would make a difference. And you could have the IRS be more muscular in its enforcement of returns. I see errors and lies and problems in tax returns every day because I'm I 990, which is the tax return that 501cs publish. I love them. I obsessively go through them all the time. I'm weird like that, and I don't care. I just enjoy them. And I see mistakes and deceit all the time. I've very rarely seen the IRS punish these groups for those mistakes or those deceits. So there's more the IRS could do. It could be more muscular, could police more. The other option is to tear down the 501c system and rebuild it. Some sort of tax exempt status for organizations that are not turning a profit but giving money. But the objections to this go well beyond the Islamist scope. There is a lot of money tied up in the 501c system, from big business to community foundations. It underpins American society. This would be the most extraordinary financial revolution of many decades if you were to tear down the 501c system. So it is not done lightly, and you better have a good answer for what replaces it. So for the moment, smaller incremental reform looks to be the way. I think it starts with transparency, as mentioned. You can cause a lot of trouble for extremist movements exploiting the 501c system by forcing them to report. Because the point about lawful Islamists, these charities are lawful. They're operating lawfully. They may be moving money to terror abroad, but for the most part, they're doing it lawfully through bad choices in our legal system. They're managing to keep their heads above water legally. So there's a lot that can be done to go after these groups just by enforcing laws, also by changing some of the way we regard the law. And these groups I mentioned are operating lawfully, but with small revisions to the way we view material support for terror, that behavior does not become lawful. If you are a charity and you're funding a group you know to be a proxy for, say, Hezbollah, to me, that should count as material support of terrorism. And currently, it really doesn't. Now, the federal government is a bit varied in the way it interprets this law. And back under the Obama administration, Eleanor Kagan, who's now a Supreme Court justice, said that when you help Hezbollah build homes, you're helping Hezbollah build bombs. So at times, the federal government has understood this and have prosecuted selectively based on that. But we seem to have lost that lesson. We seem to have forgotten that, and it's no longer enforced. So codifying these ideas that indirect subsidy of terror counts as material support could go a long way to fixing some of these problems in the 501c system that we've outlined. And the final thing I think should be questioning the amount of money the US government gives to the 501c system, which is in the many, many, many hundreds of billions. It's an extraordinary amount for what is supposed to be a private charitable system in the United States. As DOJ is finding out for its own investigations, there's a lot of accusations of waste and bloated behavior and so on. Whether they're right is another matter. But at the very least, I can tell you just from analyzing public subsidy of both Muslim and Islamist organizations in the United States for the last 7-8 years that I've been doing this, I see a huge amount of money wasted, even among the good grants. So rethinking government's relationship to religious organizations as grantees, I think, is also an important next step.
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to follow up on that you mentioned was this idea that when we look at USAID funding in particular, that there's a or there's a claim to be non-discriminatory in terms of where they give their money out. But then you pointed out, well, you don't see neo-Nazi groups or KKK getting funding. In terms of a lot of the Islamist groups getting funding and that kind of just continuing to go, without any challenge, do you feel that there may be an angle to that where there is a fear of being accused of being Islamophobic if that funding is questioned, or if there is more scrutiny on some of those groups, even though they actually do the most damage to most Muslims with a lot of the radical, views that, those organizations perpetuate? But do you think that plays into it? Or if not, is there something else that may be impacting that?
Well, one is the point we discussed as it relates to USAID, but also other department funding. One is this idea, this fallacious idea that some of these charities can be assets, ideological assets. So that's still a small part of it, as we discussed earlier. I think your point that there's a fear of that selective funding and saying no to certain groups would inspire accusations of Islamophobia is absolutely spot on. In fact, we've had sort of informal chats with policymakers where that's been tacitly acknowledged in the past. I wish I could find a way to prove that on the record from the federal government itself, but yeah, I can tell you just off the record, conversations have mentioned that. So that's part of it. It does explain as well. I mean, one figure I like to spout, especially in front of a conservative audience when I have them, is that the Trump administration gave much more to Islamists than the Obama administration. In fact, it went up by an order of three. So yeah, 3 times as much money going to radical groups, not at USAID explicitly, but across federal departments and agencies. Our best guess at the time, because I don't think anyone's going to think that Donald Trump or his acolytes are secretly or Islamist sympathizers. Our best guess at the time was that this partly was done as a sort of counterbalance to things like the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban. It was a way to go after one group of radicals while not totally alienating a potential demographic. And indeed, that's paid off for Donald Trump. The 2024 election relied heavily on the Muslim vote, which turned out in places like Michigan, turned out for him very well, including some groups up there that got federal funding under the first Trump administration. Now, I can't absolutely link those two things, but I'm saying that's interesting. So yeah, I think bribery is also part of it. I think both Democrats and increasingly Republicans use federal funds to win votes. And we're seeing that. Will we see it with the second Trump administration? I don't know. Given all this cost cutting, maybe not. I hope not. The problem with federal reporting of funding is it's usually a year or two out of date. So I won't be able to answer that question for another few years. It's going to be an interesting time, this administration, certainly.
Absolutely. And I think I have one more question to kind of wrap up today's conversation. But obviously, I think there's so much here that I definitely have to have you back for a follow-up conversation after the next several months to see how things play out a little bit more. But I think one of the other things that's come out of some of these, investigations into USAID funding is not just, potentially funding extremist groups, but also looking at where funding is going in terms of internal political or social, or let's say promoting, allegedly political or social reforms in other countries. Do you see any linkages there? And the reason I'm asking is because, obviously we talked about Jamaat-e-Islami being very powerful in Bangladesh. We saw what happened in Bangladesh last year in terms of the Sheikh Hasina and Awami League government being toppled by mass student protests, and also obviously some other issues that were involved there. But Jamaat-e-Islami has a very powerful student wing, and there was indication that they were also involved in the protests and helped to kind of push it over the top. And now there's reports of funding coming out in terms of, different political projects that were funded in Bangladesh. So not necessarily just in the Bangladesh case. I mean, that's kind of, on my mind because I see all these pieces and we focus a lot on that area. But do you see some of that connected in terms of the extremist groups that are potentially getting funding? And then also what's happening in these countries in terms of toppling of governments or at least meddling in internal affairs and promoting other agendas. Can we connect the dots to some extent in terms of what's happening?
I think we can connect the dots. And just looking at the case of Bangladesh, a lot of the groups that struggled to operate in Bangladesh under the Sheikh Hasina government, groups we've mentioned today, such as Helping Hand and Islamic Relief, they faced opposition from that former Bangladeshi government because of their very well documented known involvement with Islamism, including Jamaat-e-Islami. It's surely no coincidence that domestically their partners and allies, including their sister organizations, were involved in lobbying the US Commission on Religious Freedom to go after certain players within Bangladesh to draw attention to some of the measures implemented by the Hasina government that the charities arguing were impacting there. There are absolutely connections. Proving it absolutely, I think, will become possible in the next few years as documents become available, more funding. It's going to be very interesting to see if the funding behavior of some of these charities and their taxpayer subsidies changes over the next few years with this this post-Hasina government in power. Certainly, I can tell you this, certainly as someone who follows Western Islamist charity gossip and internal conversations as best I can, they are very excited by the new Bangladesh. They see it as a blank slate for implementing some grand ideological designs. So I'm very worried about that. I think you can certainly draw attention to previous funding as well. I think there's still more on every aspect of the Bangladesh story. There's still more to come out on that. And one thing I'm hoping, the Trump administration has promised transparency on its funding issues. So I'm really hoping we're going to get some good documents and good funding data over the next few years that show exactly to what extent US government agencies and US taxpayer money was involved in the tumult that has gone on the last few years there.
Absolutely. And I think having as much transparency as possible and being able to, point to where the money is going and the paper trails, I think is going to become exceedingly important as particularly that part of the world is becoming more and more, I think, tumultuous. And we see a lot of those things being connected to groups and, activities here in the US as well, not just with South Asia, but with the Middle East and with Hamas proxies here in addition to that. And I think with that, that's going to bring us to the end of our conversation today. But as usual, Sam, really fascinating, in-depth conversation, and kudos to you and your team for another well-researched and well-documented report. And we look forward to more studies on this subject and more revelations coming out about where, unfortunately, our taxpayer money has been going and what it's been funding. I think it's important, it's vital that the American people know about this and that our policymakers and others take some concrete action to help alleviate some of these issues. So on our way out, if you can tell everyone how they can follow your work and where they can find out more information about this particular report and continue to follow you on social media, please let our listeners know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. If you want to follow my work or indeed my colleagues' work at the forum on this subject, please go to our website, meforum.org. And there you'll find outlets like Focus on Western Islamism, where we publish these reports and with the raw data, as I said. And if you ever have any questions, please get in touch. We're always happy to engage and work with you, the listeners of groups like Indo-American Foundation. So thank you so much for having me on.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.